All right, well, we are beginning a brand new book today, and that is the book of 1 Samuel. Today we will begin with an overview of kind of both books of 1 and 2 Samuel. And this is lesson number 50 since we have started our Old Testament series. So 50 lessons in, that's pretty good. So we're making our way through. We're what? Third of the way through, maybe, if that. So anyway, we still got a long way to go. But 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel is going to be our focus. Of course, 1 and 2 Samuel are a continuation of everything we've been looking at from Genesis. And that's really what's going on here in the Old Testament. It's God's story of redemption, which is coming through a nation called Israel. And we saw that early on with Abraham and the calling of Abraham and the covenant God makes to God bringing the people of Israel out of Egypt, establishing them in the promised land. And then we've seen the life in the promised land hasn't quite gone as smoothly as it could have. We had that period of the Judges that we have just looked at. And the period of the Judges was marked with continual unrest. It was marked with these warriors that were called judges that would be raised up to defeat the enemies of Israel that were coming against them because of their rebellion against God. And so God raised up these judges to show His mercy and to bring victory to Israel, only to have them go and repeat the cycle over and over again. The time of Judges was marked with everyone did what was right in their own eyes, and that there was no king in Israel. And that's how we ended the book of Judges. Of course, the past 3 weeks we've looked at a good story in the book of Ruth that took place during the time of the Judges. But now we really pick up moving the theme along. Of course, Ruth moved the theme along as well with the birth of Obed, which was the father of Jesse, which was the father of David. So Ruth continues the story as well. But as we come into Samuel, we really gain steam as far as making our journey really toward Jerusalem and our journey toward the monarchy, a journey toward kings ruling over Israel. And we find that here with the prophet Samuel that is raised up. And Samuel's an interesting guy. We'll talk more about Samuel next week when we get into the text. But he kind of plays the role almost as a judge, also as a priest, intercessor for the people, and also as a prophet, a spokesperson for the people. So even though there's been references to prophecy before, and Moses stood in a priestly and a prophetic office, really attention is given to the office of a prophet here in the books of 1 and 2 Samuel, not just with Samuel, but with Nathan as well, Gad as well as another prophet. So we see several prophets rise up on the scene here. So Samuel's interesting because he kind of plays that role as a leader for Israel during this time of transition from the judges to the monarchy. So let's jump into our introduction today. And our introduction is primarily going to loosely be focused on both books and what's going on in both books, 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel. So the books of Samuel describe the rise of the prophet Samuel and deal with the transition from the time of the judges going through the establishment of the monarchy, including the reigns of Saul and David, up to the declining years of David's reign. The two books of Samuel were originally one book in Hebrew and found on a single scroll in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So 1 and 2 Samuel in the Hebrew Bible is one book, but because of the Greek and Latin versions, when it was translated into Greek and Latin, because of the length of the book of Samuel, it was divided up into two parts, 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel. The title of the books in the Christian and Hebrew Bibles are referred to as the books of Samuel, and that's, of course, in recognition of the significant role that the prophet Samuel plays in establishing the monarchy. The Septuagint, which was the first Greek translation of the Old Testament, combines the book of Samuel with the book of Kings under the title Kingdoms. So there's one title in the Septuagint. The events of the book, when do these events take place? Of course, it's really difficult without a chart to think about when all this stuff happens in the Old Testament. It is so distant from us. In fact, one writer says we, from today, are closer to the year 5000 than we are back to David's time, which if you think now to the year 5000, that's a long time away. But we're closer to that than we are back to David, so it's kind of hard to grasp when all of these things are happening. But to kind of place a timeline on when these events take place, it would be the last half of the 11th century in the 1000s BC, and then the early part of the 10th century, which would be the 900s. So roughly between 1050 BC and 970 BC is when these events take place, about 1,000 years before the birth of Jesus. It's difficult to determine when the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel were written. We don't know. Primarily, it's believed that they were written pretty close to its actual happening, because one of the characteristics of 1 Samuel is the specifics and the details in the literature and in the dialogue. The dialogues are very specific in 1st and 2nd Samuel. But it's difficult to determine. And again, like most books of the Bible that we've seen, because this is the Bible for grown-ups, there was probably a good portion written, and then later on could have been edited, added, put together as a cohesive story before its final form. And we do, pretty confident that at least some portions of this were written a little bit later. For example, we have here in 1 Samuel chapter 27, verse number 6, it refers to the city of Ziklag, and it makes this statement: Ziklag has belonged to the kings of Judah to this day. That's written in 1 Samuel. Well, when 1 Samuel was written, there was no kings of Judah. That didn't come until after 1st and 2nd Kings, when the nation was divided between the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. So the fact that that verse there says that Ziklag belonged to the kings of Judah to this day means at least that one verse was written way after the events of 1st and 2nd Samuel took place. So like with most people and scholars and history looking at the Bible, you have your pure, real conservative fundamentalist that says everything had to be written right then, and then you have your liberal scholars that says no, everything was written way in the future. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle. There was probably a majority of the events and dialogue and stories written during or shortly after the time they took place in 1 Samuel, with some later editing and additions and things to kind of smooth the story over before it's presented in its final form. Nothing controversial about that. That's just how things go. So we don't know exactly when everything was recorded or written. Another thing we don't know of is who wrote the book of 1 Samuel or the book of 2 Samuel. Early tradition links the Samuel with writing the work because of his great influence. Early Jewish writings attributed it to Samuel as well, but the text itself does not give any indication of who wrote. Again, many of the stories read like eyewitness accounts because of the details, because of how everything is written. It seems to be written by those who are eyewitnesses or very close to the events itself. But at the end of the day, we don't know who physically penned the words to these books. Talking about the time of 1st and 2nd Samuel and what kind of is the historical setting, we have already touched on a little bit. The book of 1 Samuel begins in the Judges period, a time when the people did what was right in their own eyes. The tabernacle at this time, we haven't talked much about the tabernacle during the time of Judges, but the tabernacle is at Shiloh, where Joshua had finished dividing the land and it was set up at Shiloh. Unfortunately, during this time, the nation lacked good political and spiritual leadership. So it begins as a transition book between the time of the judges, where there was no central leadership, going to the time where there will be a central leadership in Israel. Another thing that takes place is this was a prime time in history for the nation of Israel to move to a monarchy. Because what you have going on in the world surrounding Israel is the traditional powers, Assyria, Babylon, and Egypt, they were all kind of in a decline during this time. So they posed no real threat to Israel becoming a kingship. However, Israel's neighbors in the Promised Land that they failed to drive out always presented a problem. We've seen in Judges, we saw a lot of the Canaanites, in the local Canaanite nations giving Israel a problem. Here we're introduced really the real foe to Israel is what we would call the Philistines. We're familiar with the Philistines, but they are a recent arrival. People of Indo-European descent. They settled along the Judean coast, and they began to give Israel problems during this time. Israel found themselves fighting with the Philistines, and so they struggled with this issue as they found themselves fighting with the Philistines. How could they present a unified front against their enemies? Because if you remember, in the book of Judges, you have this cycle. The people would disobey God. He would give them to their enemies. God would raise up an individual leader who would defeat the local enemies and bring peace back to the land for a certain time, and then they would go through this cycle. But now, Israel wants something more permanent. They want to be like the other nations. So they ask for a king. So the book of 1 Samuel relates how the Israelites attempted to solve the problem, have a unified front, have a unified leader, be like the other nations, and that would be to have a king crowned in their nations. There's a lot of political things going on behind the text as well here in history. As far as the content and the overview of what's going on in these books, the story centers on three key people. First of all is Samuel, which can be described as one of the last of the judges or last ruler of the period of the judges, and also the first prophet to the nation who appoints the first two kings. He appoints Saul, Israel's first king, and he appoints David, Israel's most important king. There's four basic parts to the book of 1 Samuel and even going on into 2 Samuel. Part 1 is about Samuel alone, the prophet Samuel alone. The essentials about Samuel is his birth, his call, and then his early career as a prophet. And then the loss and return of the Ark of the Covenant, followed by the eventual a great victory over the Philistines. So the first part, 1 through 7, is about Samuel the prophet alone. Chapters 8 through 15, in part 2, Samuel and Saul, their stories begin to overlap. And there's two matters that are essential here. That's Yahweh's affirmations of and warnings about the monarchy. The monarchy is seen, and a king in Israel is seen as a good thing, but also not a good thing. At times it's talked about in a positive way, and at times it's talked about in a not so positive way, leading some critical scholars to think that some of these parts were put together by different writers, some that are for the monarchy, some that are against the monarchy. I think it's better maybe to look at it just as there are positives to having a king and there's negatives to having a king. And Samuel portrays both the positives and the negatives of having a king in Israel. So there are affirmations of having a king, but there's also warnings from God to the people about having a king. And so we have to weigh these positives and negatives that even God shares with his people about having a king. Also deals with the beginning of Saul's reign and then God's ultimate rejection of Saul as king. So Saul is anointed king and he's also rejected king. So Saul and Samuel, their stories take place in part 2. Part 3, which goes from 1 Samuel 16 to 31, Saul and David overlap. After Saul, somebody else will be anointed as the next king, and that would be David. Here's the problem. You have David anointed to be the next king, while Saul is already the king. And you have David rising to power, while Saul's kingdom is coming down, and those two are overlapping, and that's going to cause a lot of problems between Saul and David, as we will look at more in depth at those. The essential story is told at the beginning and end, the anointing of David to replace Saul as king, then ultimately the death of Saul and his heir apparent Jonathan. Thus, it's all about David's rise and Saul's decline. That's what part 3 is about, David's rise and Saul's decline, as well as Saul's constant pursuit of David in order to kill the upstart rival to his dynasty. So lots of drama takes place in part number 3 of the book of 1 Samuel. And then part 4 in the overall story is in 2 Samuel, which 2 Samuel concentrates on David's reign. The highlights of David's reign, David has a lot of victories for Israel, military victories. David sets up Jerusalem as the center of Israel, the place of where the monarchy would rule from, and Jerusalem plays a very important role. He does this through bringing the Ark of the Covenant brings the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem and sets it up as the central place of worship. Then another major part in David's reign is the covenant that God makes with David. God makes a brand new covenant with David. So some of the major covenants we've seen is God's covenant with Abraham to establish a people and a land. God's covenant with Israel through Moses as the law, and now God's covenant with David that will play a huge role moving forward, where the promise of one of David's offsprings will sit and occupy David's throne continually, forever. And that will ultimately be fulfilled, spoiler alert, in Jesus Christ. And then, of course, David's moral failure with Bathsheba, and then the subsequent troubles that happen in David's family are at the forefront as well in David's life. So that's the 4 ways you can kind of break down what's going on in 1 and 2 Samuel. All about Samuel and Saul, about Saul and David, and then about David. So that's what's happening there. Then there are certain and several theological implications. What is it teaching us about theology? What's it teaching us about God? What's it teaching us about spiritual matters? What's it teaching us about God's plan of redemption moving forward? Because, yes, there are a lot of individual stories in the books of 1 and 2 Samuel, and we can get caught up in the individual nature, but also what we've talked about in all of this is while we're looking at the individual stories, we're keeping an eye on the overarching story. The overarching story here is the story of redemption. So the theological purposes of the book of Samuel is to tell the story of the establishment of the kingship covenant with David, or the Davidic covenant. That's going to be where we're heading to. It's not just about establishing a kingdom in Israel, but it's about God's redemptive plan. And God's redemptive plan will be seen in God's unconditional covenant with David that we just mentioned. That one of his offspring would sit and establish his throne in righteousness and justice forever. And that's what we're going to see in the Davidic covenant. And this covenant would lead to God's ultimate king Jesus, who would take the throne of David. In the book of Acts chapter 2, that says at Jesus' resurrection, he took the throne of David. So I can't wait to get into that aspect. Lots of good stuff there. Some of the key themes and ideas that we find here. There are 4 major key themes that we will look at here in the book of 1st and 2nd Samuel. First of all is the shifts that are taking place within the nation of Israel itself. There are 3 major shifts. One book calls them tectonic shifts that happens here in structuring of the kingdom of Israel. First of all, the worship. The worship. As we mentioned, that the tabernacle was set up in Shiloh in the days of Joshua, and there it remained. But now there's going to be a shift from worship, or the central place of worship, from Shiloh and the tabernacle over to Jerusalem. The interesting thing that David's going to do. Of course, David is described in the New Testament as a man after God's own heart. The main thing David's going to do is he's going to take the Ark of the Covenant, not the whole tabernacle, but the Ark of the Covenant, and he's going to move it to Jerusalem. And he's going to pitch a tent over the Ark of the Covenant, and David is going to establish his own tabernacle. And David's own tabernacle would be instituted, with sacrifices and all of this, but the main difference in David's tabernacle is it would be a place of music and worship. So David's going to take the Levites, and instead of just giving them a knife to slit the throats of animals, he's going to give them instruments. And he's going to institute expressive worship around his tabernacle and around the Ark of the Covenant. And it's there that David would pen many of his psalms. Many of the songs of Israel would take place. So worship, not just location, but up until this time, worship had really been about sacrificing animals. But now worship is going to come through David more from the heart of worship. And it will be expressed in music and psalm and bodily expressions, and as seen in the book of Psalms. So worship to Yahweh is even going to take on a different form and shape here in Jerusalem. Number 2, Israel's leadership will change from the periodic local judges to the establishment of king, to establishment of the monarchy. So no longer raising up a judge when an enemy threatens, and then in another area, another judge is going to be raised up, and then in another area, another judge is going to be raised up. We're going to have this lineage of monarchy, which again sounds good in theory because it can establish a unified nation, it can establish a unified military, it can ward off any threats from any local tribes. But as we see with everything else, the establishment of the monarchy does not go well ultimately. From the beginning of Saul to David's moral failures to seemingly victories, Solomon's victories to Solomon's downfall, and then the nation dividing after Solomon's death and going into basically civil war. But we see these changes happening from the periodic judges to the establishment of a unified monarchy. Then the third thing we see in Israel's shifts is Israel is transformed as a nation as a whole. And it goes from really a tribal league governed by the individual tribes to a unified kingdom, capable of exercising imperial power over neighboring states. So during the time of the judges, and even how Joshua set it up, individual tribes kind of ruled themselves. They were one, but they were governed in these individual tribes. Now in a unified kingdom, you have many tribes being one nation ruled under one leader and seen more as a local power than just this tribal nation. So these are major shifts that are happening spiritually and politically for Israel as well. The second major theme, obviously, is the monarchy, which is the big theme, the theme of kingship. Interest in the Israelite monarchy dominates the book from its beginning to its establishment. What we see the initial request, where the people request to Samuel. They request a king. Samuel's not thrilled with the king, Israel, because he already thinks he's doing a good enough job. His sons who are going to succeed him, maybe he wanted to be the establishment of the kingdom because he set his sons after him up to rule, but they were not good rulers. So the request for it, then the establishment of the kingdom with King Saul, then the tragic reign of King Saul, which did not end well. Then it's 2 King David, then God's great promises to David in his covenant. But then we have David's decline. So all of these are recorded in the books of 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel. So obviously, the monarchy is exactly what 1 2 Samuel is all about. From a biblical standpoint, we touched on this. The kingship over Israel was the prerogative of Yahweh. It was told earlier on in previous books that Israel would have a king. But one of the problems with the establishment of the kingdom in Israel is that the people didn't desire a king for the sake of Yahweh, for somebody representing Yahweh. Because that's ultimately what the kingdom would be. Israel's king was supposed to be the earthly representative of Yahweh to his people and to the other nations. But the people didn't see it that way. The people saw the king ruling over them as they wanted a strong king who's going to defeat their enemies to make them stronger than the other nations. All the other nations, all the other superpowers, they have a king. We want a king. Not we want a king that will help us submit to Yahweh. We want a king who will give us victory. So the people's view, from God's viewpoint, and from the people's viewpoint of kingdom, were different views of what a king would be. They wanted a strong military king, a strong leader so they could look powerful. God wanted someone that would represent him to lead the people into faithfulness to him. So the problem was in the fact that in desiring a king, Israel, the people wanted to be like other nations. And it's presented as they wanted a king to be like other nations, but from God's viewpoint, they were actually rejecting God as their king. Because when they ask for a king, Samuel goes to God. God tells him, they're not just rejecting you, Samuel, who is a prophet, who is a spiritual leader, but God says they're rejecting me as well. So there you begin to see how the people their hearts always turned against the Lord. They always turned against the Lord. We saw that in Judges, time and time and time again. The people left to themselves will always turn against the Lord. And that is, going back to our gospel circle last week, that was the failure of the law, that they couldn't keep it. That was the failure of even the greatest command, love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your strength. The problem with that is it sounds good, but Israel couldn't do it. Their hearts always turned away because left to our own human nature, our hearts will always go after our own self-interests. It will go after our own pride. It will go after trying to find our own way. And we see that being played out here with Israel's request and the choosing of Saul to be their king. Because as we see here, Israel's king was never to operate apart from Yahweh. The monarchy ought to have been theocratic. God ruled, God being their king in nature. Even when there was a human king, he was supposed to only be the representative of the divine king. Thus, the scripture indicates that the people's insistence on having a king was really a willful rejection of the Lord's rule over them. The willful rejection of the Lord's rule over them. Almost going back to almost going back to Mount Sinai. When Moses says, God wants to speak to you from the mountain. And they said, we don't want to hear from him. He's too scary. This mountain's on fire and there's clouds and smoke and thunder. We don't want to hear from him. Moses, you go and hear from him. And you come back. So instead of being ruled by God's voice, they were ruled by a mediator, Moses, and his law. And the law governed them instead of the voice of God. Where now they're like, we don't want him to rule over us. We want a king. Somebody that's head and shoulders, a strong person that can lead us. Who's stronger than Yahweh? Who's stronger than God? But no, they wanted a Saul to be put in the place. Even at the choosing of David, you remember, Samuel going to Jesse's house. Jesse brings out his sons that look like a king, not the one that God chose who was in the field singing and writing poetry, out there. So again, the people's will and God's will for them are kind of clashing here in the monarchy. Next, we have the prophets. Whereas the author certainly highlights the monarchy, he also presents it in a prophetic perspective. The scriptures would establish the continuing importance of the prophetic office to provide God's guidance to the king. So the prophets Samuel and Nathan play a prominent role in 1st and 2nd Samuel in dealing with Saul and David, in both encouraging them and condemning them. We're most familiar when Nathan confronts David after his sin with Bathsheba. Well, that's what prophets did. They heard from the Lord and they spoke to the king, guiding them, encouraging and condemning them when necessary. We see the kings were obligated to be sensitive to the prophets who interpreted the covenant for the nation. For even though there was the king, there was still the covenant, the law that ruled the people. And then the final key theme that we'll look at today in our introduction is David and the Davidic covenant. We've talked about this already. But the prominent theme in both 1st and 2nd Samuel is the rise, the establishment, and the continuation of the Davidic dynasty in Israel. The books of Samuel paints David, even through his faults and failures, as God's true anointed king. And really the way things are written here, and I don't think it's meant, I think it's written from a historical standpoint to Israel for an agenda, but not misrepresenting for the point of an agenda. We see that a lot. So we see people misrepresent things to forward their agenda. But there is an agenda to the writing here. And first of all, that is to show that David is the true, chosen, legitimate king of Israel. And that's for the generation that the writer is writing to and for future generations, to show that David is the rightful king. Because someone could easily say, well, David came in and usurped the authority of Saul and rose to power, by getting rid of Saul. Underhanded, undermined. And so a lot of the story here is written to show that David was not the reason for Saul's downfall. That David didn't underhandedly, conspire to get Saul out of the way so David could be king. So there's concern to show the failures of Saul independently from and prior to his relationship with David. That Saul was already on his way down. David did not cause the downfall of Saul. The point is that David did not cause Saul's failure. Rather, Saul had disqualified himself. The concern of the narrator here was to demonstrate that even though David was destined by the Lord to rule, he did not usurp the throne of Saul. David's legitimate rise to the throne, as well as his successes as king in 2 Samuel, was crowned by bringing the Ark of the Covenant out of exile, placing it back in operation. This was followed immediately by the formation of the Davidic covenant, which stood as a charter for the new era. The Davidic covenant was the centerpiece of the narrator's agenda. So everything leads to God's covenant with David, to show David is the legitimate king, to show his victories, and to show the covenant. Even in the midst of David's failures, because there was so many of David's failures that happened here. So if the writer was misrepresenting for an agenda, he probably wouldn't have put all of David's bad stuff in there. In fact, we'll see in the book of Kings and Chronicles, there is more of an agenda being played in the differences between those two books and what is shared and what is not shared than we find here in the book of 1 Samuel. Because there's a lot of information in Kings that's not shared in Chronicles. Because Kings is showing one thing and Chronicles is showing a different thing. Not contradictory, but just some things are conveniently left out to paint a better picture. But 1 and 2 Samuel, I believe, show a true picture of what is happening. It shows David's faults, but yet it shows God's hand upon him. And in all of David's faults, in all of his failures, he is the legitimate king. He is God's chosen king, and his dynasty is God's plan for a continuing king on the throne. So everything in the narrative up to this point has been moving in this direction toward the covenant. So from here on in the narrative, everything is to be understood in light of the covenant. In light of the covenant. So those are our themes. That's what's going on here. It can be pretty deep of what's going on here. There's a lot of moving parts, especially when we get into the individual narratives. There is no lack of drama here in the book as well. So that's our introduction. Your last page, we won't really go through this because we're going to go through it in weeks to come. But these are our outlines. I put an outline of 1 Samuel and an outline of 2 Samuel here as well. So I'm excited to jump in here because there's a lot of good stuff in here that we're going to look at. So that is our introduction to the books of Samuel.